I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
October just finished, Tom.
It did.
It's now November. In fact, we're a week into November. And so I think it's time that we wrap up October albums.
Yeah, there were a lot of them.
There was a ton of albums that came up in October. So much music. And I tell you what, Tom, it never ceases to blow my mind each month when we look at all the albums that were released, and just the sheer quantity is just overwhelming.
It is.
Yet we trudge through.
The music does not stop.
We trudge through. We are devoted, and I need to thank you, Tom, because without you copying and pasting names of bands and albums into the spreadsheet that we keep, I would never know that most of these things come out or take the time to listen to
It's like
them.
a never-ending to-do list.
It is a never-ending to-do list. Now, there's good things with that. You always have stuff to listen to.
Yeah.
You always have stuff to listen to. Whenever I'm just like out and about, I've been playing this game called Ingress. I don't know, some people may have heard about it before, but like I go out and I'll go play Ingress, and I'll put on just whatever. I'll pull up the Google sheet that we have, and I'll just play an album from it. And there's so many that I always have something to listen to and always something to think about while I'm walking around town playing this game. So I really appreciate that, and I thank you for putting this together. This month was very overwhelming.
Yeah, it was fruitful.
It was very fruitful. So in no particular order, I think it's time we dive into all of the albums that came out. Now, this isn't a comprehensive list. This is the list that I will say Tom and I screened, and there's a couple that we just, for time purposes, we left off the list. But this is the list we'd like to present to you. And again, no particular rating, just as we did with the September album wrap-up. Yes, Tom and I used to do album reviews on YouTube, and we used to score things, and we would belabor the point and talk about everything that made that album, that score. You guys can do that if you want. We're not of the mindset that we're going to give you a score. We're really thinking now that we're just going to provide you guys with just whether or not we like the album, whether or not we recommend it. We haven't put in the listens. We will admit we have not put in the listens to feel like we could give you a good score. We just have an indication of whether or not we like or dislike the record. Some of these albums that we'll be talking about today, we've obviously given many listens, and some of them we've probably only listened to once. So, bear that in mind with everything we say here. These are just general recommendations. If something we say piques your interest, go out, listen to the music, and leave us your thoughts at www.velocitiesandmusic.com. Send us an email at velocitiesandmusic.gmail.com. And also, always follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, because that's where we talk with you. Tom, let's kick it off.
Let's do it. So to start off with, we've got Guy Garvey's Courting the Squall. Guy Garvey is, of course, the lead singer, frontman of Elbow, which is one of our favorite bands.
Definitely one of our favorite bands.
And this is his first solo record, which, not surprisingly, sounds pretty similar to Elbow.
Yeah.
I mean, the guy is a huge songwriting force driving Elbow. His vocals are at the forefront. I mean, to me, it's that logical change where it sounds like Elbow, but only a little bit more sparse in the guitars and the percussion, a little more focus on some piano, and the vocals take even more of the focus.
Yeah, it's definitely focused around Guy Garvey's voice and his lyrics, which are stupendous as always. To me, this album is kind of like when Tom York released his solo album, The Eraser, in 2006, and it was essentially just stripped down version of Radiohead, right?
Yeah.
This is a stripped down version of Elbow. If you like Elbow, this is definitely an album you want to check out. You'll probably find it fairly enjoyable. We certainly did.
Yeah.
Next up, we have the new record from a band called Beach Slang, called The Things We Do to Find People Like Us. Tom?
Long album title.
Yeah, Tom, we talk about music. That's what we do to find people like us.
That's true.
So about this album, this is kind of alternative rock that really has punk roots. I think it's unfair to call this pop punk.
It is.
Like what came out in the
that
early 2000s.
has a connotation that is very specific.
It does. I feel like this is a step evolved from that. This is far more progressive than any of those bands, but certainly has elements of that. So if that's a sound you're into, this might be something worth picking up and taking a listen. I found this record to be fairly enjoyable. Lots of driving, catchy guitar riffs. The lyrics were very endearing, and I thought that really provided a decent warrant for the music. I found myself listening very closely.
Definitely check it out if you're a fan of the Replacements or the Hold Steady. It's kind of in that vein, but I think it's a little raw.
Yeah, pretty decent record.
Next is Evil Blizzard, Everybody Come to Church. This is a band I had not heard of. From what I know, they're not really all that huge, but it was a very interesting record.
Interesting album cover, too.
Interesting album artwork. I think the whole idea of this band is very kind of odd, kind of out of nowhere even, too. So
borderline shock value?
A little bit,
yeah.
A little overly colorful. To me, it sounds like that kind of like biting rock in the vein of like Primus, but if Primus was trying to be a little more dark and satirical rather than just that kind of fun Primus rock vibe.
Yeah, to me, it had a lot of Black Sabbath and Primus influence to
Definitely.
it. The thing that I found with this record is it just didn't resonate with me very often, and I have to say, like, while clearly influenced by those two legendary artists, I feel like this is a step down from that.
I agree. I will say that I started to like it more in the back half of the album. I thought the back half was a little stronger in the front. The first few tracks left kind of a bad taste in my mouth. It just felt over the top. I ended up coming up on it a little bit, but it's something that I more remember for the style than the songwriting. I don't think the songwriting is really going to bring me back to it.
Fair. Next, we have a metal record from a band we think is called Vole. The album title is Deeper Than Sky. Before Tom and I turned this on, we were really debating whether or not it was pronounced Vole or Vhol. So you guys,
Vhol just sounds awful.
It does sound awful, but you never know. It's a metal band, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So this is a very thrashy, but almost at times sludgy metal experience. And overall, I typically really like thrashy, sludgy metal. Mm-hmm. This didn't really get my interest going very, very much.
Yeah, it's one of those that I enjoyed while I was listening to it, but there's actually a lot of good metal coming out this year.
Yeah.
And I feel like this doesn't really rise to the occasion compared to some of the other stuff. I do like the style. It reminded me of this kind of like Rainbow or Dio / Iron Maiden kind of mix. Not as progressive as Iron Maiden, as you mentioned, a little thrashier. But for me, it was just kind of one of those, this is good, but not great.
Yeah, it was very technically impressive. I just felt that it lacked warmth. It was just loud and thrashy and intense to be loud, thrashy, and intense. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does prevent me from connecting on an emotional level. And that's really what I need to fall in love with the record. So I can appreciate this for what it is, but so far I haven't fell in love with it.
Next, we've got Shining with their new album, International Blackjazz Society. Shining is a band that I kind of put on my radar when their last record came out. And this one, they keep a very similar style. There's a reason that Black Jazz is in the album title. They incorporate some saxophone, almost sounds like Zoo, if you've heard of Zoo. Great band that Jake and I reviewed their album Carboniferous. I really like it. It's one I come back to. Right. If you kind of mix that style, that big, just trashy sounding kind of, demonic saxophone driven sound, but then also incorporate a little bit of almost industrial edge to it, kind of a Marilyn Manson type romp. Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I think is very unique, but it's very over the top. And I enjoy the energy, but at the same time, there are bits of this album that come off as a little bit butt rocky to me, I'll admit.
The whole point of this is to completely abandon tact and create this all-out assault on your ears. It's all about volume. It's all about being over the top, like you said. Mm-hmm. And I think that they commit so hard to their particular sound that they really don't afford the listener any time to catch their breath or establish like a period of just quieter times on the album, like more dynamics. There's no emotional resonance in there. It's just loud. It's shock value, kind of like Sleigh Bells. The more that you listen to Sleigh Bells, the less endearing I think they are. And the more that I listened to this record, the less endearing I found it. At first, I was like, wow, this is such a cool sound, such cool presentation because it's so raw and in your face and shocking. But then after a while, it wears thin because they're not providing that emotional dynamic or the actual volume dynamic. Sure. If you like fuzzy psychedelic blues rock that sounds like has like a thick, heavy garage sound, you should probably check out the new record from Fuzz called 2. I will admit I haven't listened to 1, but I assume this is their second record. And to me, this was very influenced by Black Sabbath, which is usually a good thing. In the same vein, Tom, in your notes, I see you have typical Ty Segall and Seagal. That's how Steven Seagal. That's the front man. And the OCs. And, we really like the OCs. And this kind of is in that same vein. Sure. A lot of distorted guitar, big fuzzy bass lines. Just a really nostalgic sound that I really like.
Yeah, it makes it endearing, but at the same time, it's a pretty long album. By the time I got to the end of it, and I think the last track is like the longest track on the album, I was kind of ready to be done with it. I think this is just a style that's better when kept short.
Yes.
And they take it a little too far, but they're obviously very good at it. The production is spot on, and they really nail the style. Next up, we've got Killing Joke with Pylon. Killing Joke is a band that's been around for several decades now, kind of at the forefront of post-punk, industrial. They're a big influence on the industrial scene back in the 80s, and it's great to see that they're still making albums. This is actually a really surprise release for 2015 to me, because I just didn't expect to be blown away by a Killing Joke album, but I really was. Now, I will say, I'm assuming that the inspiration to get back in the studio and do this, I mean, they had to have been playing StarCraft and had to construct additional pylons.
Clearly, Protoss.
That's what happened.
They play as Protoss.
Yep, they had to construct an additional pylon, and this is one of the best pylons that I've heard in a long time. I will say, all jokes aside, I actually really love this album. It's one that I will certainly come back to. It's got a very driving, just industrial metal tinge to it, but it doesn't feel over the top in that metal vein. It's sometimes like when I really detach myself from it, take the vocals out, it almost sounds like a differently produced, less electronic Rammstein to me at times. Yeah. But it's got this like still got this 80s gothic kind of, well, classic Killing Joke, but also like Depeche Mode kind of vibe to it. And so that marriage of songwriting and style just really works for me.
I don't think I liked it quite as much as you did, Tom. One of the things I really did like is the vocals. They sounded like a mixture of Baroness and Mastodon, two awesome alternative metal bands that we really love on Velocities and Music. Overall, I really like the sound of this album, but I feel like at times they sacrifice songwriting to achieve that sound and maintain that sound. But overall, I think that it's definitely worth a few listens and definitely one of the better records that's come out this year. 2015 has provided us with a number of great hip-hop records, and I think the game might have just dropped another one with the documentary 2.5. I think this is just all around a very well-done hip-hop record. Lots of great beats, production, delivery. It has that classic sounding motif that really never goes over the top and always is endearing to me.
Yeah, I really respect the variety that this album has, both stylistically and structurally. Game is a well-established hip-hop artist, and what I like that he's done on this album is it doesn't feel geographically confined to me. I feel like this takes elements of West Coast hip hop, Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg. Of course, there's some Snoop Dogg references in here, and he takes that kind of whole storyline of what he's gone through in his career. But I definitely feel some big like Nas and Wu-Tang Clan influences on it as well. And it also doesn't have a reliance on pop hooks that I feel like is a direction that hip hop has really gone recently that I really don't appreciate. The thing holding back this one for me, and I know it's gotten some really rave reviews, and I'm actually glad to see that because I just think artistically it's a cut above the rest. But for me, I don't find the storyline and the tracks to be overly engaging.
I really like the skits. There's a number of skits on here that told a story that I found to be interesting, but I think that that can be kind of hit and miss depending on what your preference is.
Next, we've got LV, Return to the Moon. LV is kind of a supergroup duo between, I'm going to slaughter their names, but Brent Knopf from Menomina was
We've never been able to pronounce it.
Right, no, not at all. He was an original member of Menomina who has recently left the group. And then, of course, Matt Berninger. The Behringer?
Yeah, one of those. We touched him, remember? We actually touched the man.
He's the leader of the Berninger escape plan, right?
The Behringer escape plan.
The well-known
that we touched. No. I'm going to keep saying that we touched him because we did in
at
Kansas
a national
City.
concert. That's right. No, he's the singer of the National. This is, to me, a very out-of-the-blue duo to be collaborating. But why not? I mean, Menomina and the National are two of our favorite indie acts. It's really cool to see them come together. But what I think is particularly particularly cool about Return to the Moon is that I don't think it sounds overwhelmingly like the National or Menomina.
That's the best part, is how unique it sounds. This came out completely out of the blue for me. I did not know that this was happening, that this was a thing. So when I, saw this on our list this month, and I got very excited for it. It definitely, I can hear the Menomina influence in the songwriting, and that is a remarkably good thing. It really provides, I think it's the perfect counterbalance to each other.
Sure.
The vocals that you're so familiar with from the National sound more fresh, almost there's like a different perspective, a different lens that you can hear that from or see it in. I don't know how to describe it, but it's like you're hearing something that sounds very familiar in a totally different light. And so that's strangely unique.
That's a good way to summarize it, I'd say. It feels like a fresh spin on something familiar. And while I haven't really fallen in love with this one yet, this is one that I will come back to, and I expect to grow on me, because that's just the way that these guys' music always has, and it always ends up being some of my favorites. So we'll see where I'm at by the end of the year.
I totally agree with you, Tom. A couple of years ago, when Tom and I were reviewing albums every week as Velocities and Music on our YouTube channel, we stumbled across an indie band called Beach House. We reviewed their album Teen Dream, and then a couple of years later, we reviewed Bloom. Since then, 2015 has been a very prolific year for this indie band. They came out with Depression Cherry a few months ago, before we were doing album wrap-ups, monthly album wrap-ups, and then this month they came out with another album called Thank Your Lucky Stars. Beach House, I'm just going to try to describe Beach House's sound. It's very lethargic, kind of twinkly guitars over a very dreamy soundscape, very, very slow tempo with droney yet very beautiful
I think
vocals.
That slow, stumbling tempo is key.
Yeah.
If they picked up the tempo too much, it would just kill the whole otherworldly vibe that they're going for.
It's great music for fall. It's a rainy day in fall is kind of what I think of when I think of Beach House, and that's kind of goes against the band's name. Now, what I will say about Thank Your Lucky Stars is that if you love Beach House's sound in their previous records, you will love this one, because it's totally in the same vein as most of their other works. Yes, there are minor differences in every Beach House album, but just from like an abstract level, this is just another Beach House record. And I think that's my biggest criticism of it, is I feel like this band is starting to dilute their own sound, and it's hurting the listening experience, because I'd rather just go listen to Teen Dream or even Bloom rather than listen to, and I'm kind of getting into our mini review of Depression Cherry here, but when I've listened to that album a couple times, I didn't find anything overwhelmingly different about that either. So I like, yes, it's great. Oh, cool. They're kicking out a couple albums in 2015, but why? Give me a reason why.
Yeah, Beach House is a good band, and they're one that I think is always worth keeping up with. And I'm not one of those people who think that bands have to take complete 90-degree turns every album. I think that's a little trite to assume. But at the same time, if you don't change enough from album to album, I think that you're right on, Jake. What's going to happen is people are going to say, what's my motivation to listen to this weaker album when I can get the exact same experience, only better, from something else that you've already put out?
It's not like a car where the next model might be the exact same, but that car has 35,000 less miles on it. Just because I've listened to a certain album 35,000 times doesn't mean I need the next software update or the next update of that record.
It doesn't go stale.
It shouldn't be a software update,
Yeah.
My World 2.0. My World. I just compared Beach House to Justin Bieber.
And somehow we're back to Bieber. It just always ends up that way.
Always comes full circle, buddy.
Yep. Okay. Moving on from Bieber, was somehow slipped into the conversation there. We're on to Joanna Newsom's new record, Divers. Joanna Newsom is kind of a world of her own. Her main instrument is the harp, which I think first off is going to set her apart from a lot of artists. But she definitely has this kind of classical folk bend to her. But she's off the wall. Her vocals are all over the place. She sings in very high twee falsettos. But I find that her music packs a lot of emotion and just a lot of intrigue. She really avoids the whole pop verse chorus format. So because of that classical element, her music always feels more like movements. What she does on Divers that's a little bit different than past albums like Wise, which was basically like 5 or 6 tracks of just huge sprawling craziness in a good way, and Have One on Me, which is this gigantic, really long, I think triple album. I feel like on Divers, she's got the format to be a little bit more traditional. It's an average length. The song tracks are fairly average length, but still her style remains the same, just in a bit of a different format.
This is definitely a decent record. I think in addition to her fanatical songwriting style and her ability to play the harp, she uses her voice as an instrument throughout all of her music, and especially on this record. And I think that whether or not you can really get into this album is dependent on your liking of Joanna Newsom's vocals, and how she presents her vocals, how she's using her voice as an instrument. And I think that if you can really connect with that, I think that you will find a lot of things to appreciate about this album. Next up, we have a new record from Patty Griffin called Servant of Love. This is definitely in that vein of sound that I would describe as country, folk, Americana, indie, all independent, all very alternative, not mainstream at all. But it really reminded me a lot of artists like Anais Mitchell and Laura Marling. Very emotive, it captured my attention, had a lot of warmth, and to me was definitely made me want to listen to this more than just once.
Right. Patty Griffin is a really established artist, and you can tell, when compared to a lot of other artists in this genre, that she just knows what she's doing. There are a lot of subtleties to this album, a lot of nuanced performances. The production was very apt. Everything played its part and contributed to the whole experience. It's a varied record. It's not overly repetitive. She really does a lot with it, and this is one that I just find difficult to find anything bad to say about.
Definitely one of the better records we've heard this month.
Josh Ritter also came out with a new album this month, last month now, Sermon on the Rocks. Josh Ritter is a really interesting artist. We take a look at his past couple releases and the ones that Jake and I reviewed. We've got So Runs the World Away a number of years back now, and then also The Beast in Its Tracks. And what I love about Sermon on the Rocks is it sounds nothing like either of those records.
That is the best part.
Coming off of The Beast in Its Tracks, which was a very stripped-down, melancholy breakup album, this one, it's upbeat. This is a rock album to me. It feels more in the vein of like Bruce Springsteen, Tom Petty, John Cougar Mellencamp.
Definitely.
Stuff like that, but he picks it up so well, and he changes his vocal style even to fit this new style of music that he's going for. And what I like too is that even the album title, Sermon on the Rocks, and then the cover, he's sipping a drink. There's that kind of pun on the religious imagery as well as some booze swilling, right? And that even comes up a lot in the lyrical themes. So just the package that he's put together musically, conceptually, stylistically on this record, I find to be extremely impressive.
This is one of the most solid releases from the month. I wouldn't say that this was a mind-blowingly awesome release, but Josh Ritter is such a talented songwriter. We've had a number of releases from him now that we've recommended. So Runs the World Away from a few years ago. I remember that being like one of our favorite records that came out that year. And just the quality in the songwriting is such that this is definitely one you should go check out. Next up, we have a debut album from an artist called Sun Little. The album is self-titled, called Sun Little. This is an artist whose actual name is Aaron Livingston. Sun Little is his stage name. He's an R&B artist, and his particular flavor of R&B is very soulful, atmospheric. It's a modern take on R&B, but it definitely has a very classic and even nostalgic sound at times.
Yeah, and some of the performance and writing, it definitely is a throwback to some of the old soul singers. But it has this very modern, lush production.
Definitely
sometimes rocks out on kind of the blues side. It almost sounds like Black Keys to me at times even. But this is an album I really liked. I think I liked it significantly better than you did, Jake. Sure. I found there to be a lot of variety in the songwriting. And overall, it was just a very memorable and unique experience to me.
Yep. The reason why I think I liked it a little less than you, Tom, is I just felt like some of the tracks were really, really good, and some of them just weren't as good. So that just initial impression on the track displacement, I think kept this from being an overall straight-through quality listen to me. But it's still an album that I would definitely recommend to any fans of the R&B genre, or if this is something that sounds intriguing, that wouldn't be something that would keep me away from this record. I think it's overall probably pretty solid.
Next is Chick Chick Chick, or 3 exclamation points.
Is that really how you pronounce
chick,
it?
chick.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Cool. Learning
Weird.
something.
Yeah. As If is their new record. And, you know, this just feels like a pretty typical release from this group. It's fun to listen to, but it's not something I really get in. If you're a fan of kind of dancey, fun, kind of
electro pop,
right? Exactly. Maybe along the lines of like Hot Chip, Scissor Sisters, Cut Copy.
Throw Mike Snow in there,
right? Even a little dancier though than you know. I would say check this out, but you know, while it is fun, it's not something that I really would ever want to come back to. It's like, yeah, these guys are still doing it, but I just don't care much.
I would even add on that I think that all the artists you just mentioned that we were mentioning there are all better than this. This really lacks substance to me, and most importantly, if I'm listening to a poppy, dancey electronic record, I want hooks, and this seems more beat-based than hook-based, and
yeah, that's true.
I just want a lot more hooks, and so this one really just didn't do it for me. I wouldn't recommend it. Another new release that just came out is from an artist called Borns. The album is called Dopamine. This record is, I would describe as really pretty good modern indie pop music in the same vein as like Lana Del Rey or Lorde. And I think that it comes down to how you interpret the quality of this record, the indie pop sound.
Right, it's kind of the male version,
yes.
like the man response of the artist that you just named,
right.
or even like kind of a poppier, more electronic driven beach house, because there's some atmosphere there too as well. But you mentioned indie pop, and I think that's definitely what it falls under. The thing for me is that I thought that there was some really good songwriting in spots. I don't think it was consistent. Some of the tracks were really well written, but just the performance and the presentation of it was not convincing to me at all. It just felt very manufactured, very contrived, and also the album just felt way longer than it was. It's
Definitely
not an overly
felt way
long
too
album,
long.
but I was done with it probably about 2/3
Yep, that's
way
always
into
a bad sign.
It is.
Always a bad sign.
Next, we've got Magical Cloudz. Are You Alone?
Am I alone? No, I'm in the room with you, Tom.
No, you're not. I wasn't asking you, Jake. Come on, man. Get it together. This one felt very similar in style to Impersonator, but different in a few key ways. I think that the beats were a little more subtle, a little more sparse. And the album actually, to me, was a little more consistent in quality than Impersonator, but it didn't quite have the highlights.
Yes.
I think back to tracks like Childhood's End and Bugs Don't Buzz, and I can't get enough of those tracks. And nothing really struck me about this album like that, but I thought that it was a pretty pleasing, good, straight-through listening experience. I think these guys are really just starting to hone in on what they can do.
Yeah, I would say that this is a step down from Impersonator overall for me personally. These songs didn't carry the same quality or quantity when it came to melodies that I think Impersonator did. Specifically, the track you mentioned there, Bugs Don't Buzz, I thought was one of the most beautiful songs I've heard in recent years. Definitely one of my favorites from, I think it was 2013. Overall, this was still a very good, unique sounding record. But I would really like to see more melody going forward.
Sure.
Next up, we have Life from Dan Friel. Dan Friel is from the band Parts and Labor. We reviewed one of their albums a couple years ago, Tom, that I think we really liked it.
Yeah, Constant Future. It's a great album.
Yep. And so this is his solo record, Life. And I would describe it fuzzy, bombastic electronica.
Really overly distorted.
Definitely overly distorted, but very melodic too.
Sure.
And a lot of fluttery, flowing melodies and a lot of good dynamics too.
Yeah, I liked the overall sound at first. There's some cool textures, some cool production styles. I just didn't find it to be overly gripping. I thought that the style wore thin after a while, and so it was kind of inventive, but it had little to no comeback quality for me. I really wasn't a big fan.
It's a bit dubsteppy, and what I mean by that isn't necessarily in the sound itself, but just in the effect. Like when I listen to dubstep, it's like, oh, this is cool, and then 5 seconds later, I'm like, okay, I'm done with this. I'm ready to move on to something with more substance. And I feel like there's a lot of neat musical ideas and melodies here, but overall, like, what does it actually achieve? And that's a question that I find myself still asking, even when the album has played out, which is probably not the best sign. But overall, I think I enjoyed this one a little bit more than you did, Tom, just from the fact that I enjoy melodies and progressive songwriting.
Next is Luke Haines with British Nuclear Bunkers. I'm just going to come out and say I hated this album.
This album was not good.
I absolutely hated it. I mean, it's electronic. To me, it sounds like MIDI haunted house music.
I want to break break in here and tell a story.
Okay.
There's this one time, we live in Ames, Iowa, town of 60,000 people, college town, and this old store in an old strip mall closed down, and some like PTA group decided to turn it into this cheesy haunted house. And they were nice enough to contact Tom. I think you were still in high school at the time.
I might have been.
Tom made them a soundtrack full of MIDI haunted house music.
It wasn't MIDI. It was a lot of sample base. But, let's put that out there.
And I will say this, that like really lo-fi produced haunted house soundtrack was better than this record.
I just hated this. The closest thing I could compare it to is Kraftwerk, but I actually like Kraftwerk. I regard Kraftwerk as geniuses
why are you
of what
slamming
they do.
Kraftwerk?
Right. No, hey, I like Kraftwerk, but to me this just sounded cheap. There was nothing. I just can't think of anything good to say about it. And then in like the last half of the album, some vocals come in that just made it even worse for me.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
And people who are into this kind of electronica are probably going to hate the fact that I hate it. It's not my thing, but man, I just felt like I wasted my time listening to this album.
And we're going to pan 2 albums in a row, Tom. Next up, we have Neon Indian's Vega International Night School. Now, disclaimer, we probably like Neon Indian less than most other music reviewers out there. Most critics, I think, like and appreciate this band far more than Tom and I do. Neon Indian, if you're not familiar with their sound, they're a very funky, electronic-based dance pop band, kind of along the lines, Twin Shadow, Toro y Moi. I think that Toro y Moi is probably a better fit for sound. But I mean, like, This is to me was all about the age-old battle of sound over substance. This just lacked substance. It was all about committing to that sound, and I feel like I've said this about other Neon Indian albums in the past, and this one certainly holds true here.
Yeah, I found this album to just be soulless and boring. It didn't have that warrant for me. It didn't have any emotional depth.
It lacked a lot of ideas.
Right. It just I was like, I felt like I've heard this before and I've heard it done better. Yeah. And even when it is done better, what is it really doing for me? It's just not something I can
see this, like, to me, this sound is really, it's more of a functional sound. It's something, this is an album you could put on with a bunch of people in the room that aren't really listening to the music, but like if you're truly wanting to listen to the musical experience and get something out of it, Neon Indian is not the artist I would go to, and this album certainly is in the vein of everything else that they've done, so...
All right, going from a couple of albums that we really didn't like to something we really did. Yeah. Deerhunter's Fading Frontier. Deerhunter is a very prolific group. They're constantly putting out albums. Bradford Cox is his solo work. Atlas Sound is constantly putting out albums. These guys work their asses off. And what's amazing to me is the level of quality they're able to maintain. And Fading Frontier does not put a bad mark on that record. It is different than some of their more recent work. It's, not as trashy as Monomania. Maybe a little closer to Halcyon Digest in sound.
I would say that.
But it's a little bit brighter, almost has kind of a surfy tinge to it, but it still has Bradford Cox's very classic, intimate vocals and very melodic songwriting. That's a good focus here, but they maintain a lot of their core ideals as a band and just continue to kick ass in my eyes.
Yeah, you mentioned brighter. I would also add on that this just has kind of this dreamy feel to it, as Halcyon Digest did as well. But what really kind of caught me off guard is Monomania, and we saw Deerhunter play a lot of songs from Monomania live at 8035 a couple years ago, but that was kind of a more pessimistic sound to me.
It was.
This is a very optimistic, almost uplifting sound at times, while still adhering to the Deerhunter musical trope that we're so used to. And really Bradford Cox is an amazing songwriter and continues to prove it every album that either Deerhunter or he releases solo as Atlas Sound, and this is totally in the same vein. Definitely recommend this one. Disclaimer before we start talking about the next record. Tom and I are admittedly huge Coheed and Cambria fans.
Yep.
Huge Coheed and Cambria fans. So, earlier this month, Coheed released their new album, The Color Before the Sun. Really colorful album title.
Yeah.
And if you've listened to Coheed and Cambria before, you know that they have a really colorful sound. They're a prog rock band. They're a bit poppy at times. They kind of stem from that progressive pop punk sound that was so prevalent in the early 2000s, but these guys always took it a step further than all of their peers. Most of their records have been concept records. In fact, overarching concept records. I think there's like 6 records in a row that all follow the same story, and then their last couple have been a derivation of that Amory War story that Coheed fans know and love so well. And that story has always provided Coheed with a strong foundation to build a fanatical sound on. Now, this new record, The Color Before the Sun, is the first record Coheed and Cambria have released that has absolutely no concept driving it, or at least not related to the Amory War story. And I gotta say, for me, that made it just not have as much warmth. They were doing a lot of the same things. If anything, I'd say that this sound was definitely more poppy, more chorus based, more pop punk based, in still that Coheed and Cambria high quality way. But it definitely took a step down for me because I couldn't relate to the story. It didn't mean as much.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think I like this one a little bit more than you, and I will say I've gone out of my way to listen to it 3 or 4 times because Coheed.
Well, we love this band, let's be honest.
Well, I love this band, but more specifically, I know the way that I work with Coheed.
Right.
And not a single Coheed album did I like on first listen. They're always a band that takes a lot of listens for me. Now, still, I think that there's a ceiling on this one. I think that there's a limiting factor, and that's just the fact that it is overwhelmingly poppier than their previous work. Jake, I think you and I have always really been attracted to the fact that Coheed is a band that's able to take like progressive rock, progressive metal even at times, and blend it with this kind of like pop rock, pop punk elements into a very unique blend. And I think some of that uniqueness is just a little bit gone.
Yeah.
Still, there are some track highlights for me. I really like the songs Island, From Here to Mars, Atlas. There's some songs that I will come back to, but as a whole album, I definitely think it's probably the weakest one they put out to me.
Definitely, I would still say a solid record that people should go out and I would recommend that they go out and listen to. But huge Coheed heads like us probably are going to be slightly disappointed with this one.
Next up is Israel Nash with Silver Season. I put this album on, and I feel like I kind of have to tell my experience with it like a story. I started it, I looked at the tracks, I'm like, okay, this is starting to sound like kind of alt country, but looking at it, it was, a fairly short album in tracks, but they average it like 5.5 minutes per track. And I'm thinking, how is this guy going to make an alt country album work at like 5.5 minutes per track? But by the end of it, I ended up liking it a lot more than I thought I would. This is very Neil Young influence. Sounds a lot like Neil Young. And there are some really creative, artistic things that Israel Nash is doing here. I just feel like it flip-flopped a little bit. It kind of flipped between that really inspired original sound and things that sounded a little less inspired and more derivative to me. So I would have liked to see something a little more consistent, but I will say I ended up liking it a lot more than I thought I would.
You are absolutely spot on, Tom. This might as well be a Neil Young record. Neil would be proud of this record because I think a lot of the songwriting on here is particularly innovative and really lush. I mean, there's a lot of neat ideas. These songs go all over the place. They sprawl, which is why the track lengths are just a little bit higher than what you would probably expect for this style. But overall, I felt like this was a very endearing record with a lot of things to really enjoy as you listen to it. It was just a positive listening experience. I could totally see how this would wear on you after a while, just from the particular style. It's a bit lethargic at times, but to me, that's the point, and I really liked it overall. So I think I'm a little bit higher on it than you are. Next up, we have the album called Gray Tickles, Black Pressure from the artist John Grant. To me, this is the male version of St. Vincent. There are so many correlations to St. Vincent in the sound that I feel like those two would just make an awesome supergroup. So I'm going to put that on my wish list for 2016. The whole point of this is to create a soundscape that makes you feel awkward and contorted, and while still providing the melody and hooks necessary to really get all these songs stuck in your head. This was especially in the vocals and really the lyrics too. I felt like the lyrics a lot of times, especially in the front half of the album, I felt were just almost like just so awkward that it was just grating at times. Right,
which I think, it's a good continuation from his previous album, Pale Green Ghost, which, Jake, we got to see John Grant open for Elbow. And Pale Green Ghost was an album that we listened to and didn't have time to review the year that it came out. but it's one that we both really enjoyed. And I think, as I said, this is a great continuation from that. It's a little more funky, a little more aggressive, but it fits, as you said, the lyrical tones and that style, because it's very biting. There's a lot of anger within this guy, but the way that he's putting it across is through satire. And I always feel like satire is a much better medium for communicating this kind of message, and John Grant pulls it off really well.
I really like this one. Fans of Velocities and music will remember that Tom and I are rarely very far apart on albums. However, the album we're about to talk about is certainly the exception to that otherwise rule. We're going to talk about the 5th release from the English indie rock band Editors called In Dream. The way I would describe this is, if you've listened to Editors before, this album is less of the rock side of indie rock and more on the pop side of indie rock. There's if you liked Coldplay back when Coldplay was still good, you might actually really like In Dream. I felt like there was just a lot of melody. Like I said, it's definitely presented in a way that is much more poppy, much more of an electronic tone to it. Lots of synth melodies. Got a total Depeche Mode vibe from this record. But I don't feel like they really had to sacrifice the quality of songwriting to achieve the sound that they were going for, which is something I appreciated.
Yeah, the songwriting was pretty good, and yeah, this is one where I am way lower than Jake on this one. He likes it significantly more than I do. But the thing that I think just stifled it for me a bit was a lot of the mixing and production. Things sounded so overly saturated that even when they were going for an emotional depth and kind of a low dynamic, I just felt like it was, all these compounding, supposed to be subtle synth layers that I still felt like were just screaming at me. And that backfired a little bit for me. But still, this isn't an album that I hated. I just was a little lukewarm on it. Probably worth coming back to. Editors is still a great band, one to check out. But this was surprising to me, just the change that they've made. And next, we've got another album from Waves, 5. I'm assuming that the V is for the Roman numeral 5.
Oh, okay.
I'm just going to...
I thought they just liked the letter V.
I'm just going to make that assumption.
Okay.
I'm just going to go out on a limb there. This is basically exactly what I said, another Waves album. It's
a
maybe,
good way to describe it.
Maybe a little more rockin', a little bit tighter in presentation. But, if you're a fan of these guys, you'll probably like this. If you haven't been sold on them yet, guess what? They're not going to make a believer out of you with this one.
They definitely didn't make any waves with this record.
Oh, my God. You're killing me.
Next up, we have the 9th studio release from the American rock band Mercury Rev. Now, I wouldn't call these guys rock. I would call these guys indie pop or almost twee pop, indie psychedelic rock. Like these guys have a very unique sound. I actually started listening to Mercury Rev back in the mid 2000s. When I was going through this phase where I was just trying to find anything that sounded remotely like Radiohead, and these guys fit that bill a bit. These guys have been making records for, since the early 90s, and they've pretty much been of a pretty high quality of every release throughout their career. Now, it's been 8 years since they last released an album, so this new record, The Light in You, it's refreshing because you're getting another dose of of Mercury Rev, and I found that the sound was just overall kind of fit the bill of what I would expect from a Mercury Rev album. It may be a bit poppier, a bit more, even a bit more rocking at times, but overall pretty solid Mercury Rev album.
Yeah, these guys are just good at what they do. Lush, surreal soundscapes, some grooves locking things down, pretty good songwriting. Nothing I get overly excited about, but a pretty pleasing listen. And from there we go on to Shopping and their album Why Choose. This is a very kind of classic punk sound, but then again, punk has a lot of very classic sounds to it. This is more on the edge of that kind of surf guitar influenced rock, along the lines of like X-Ray Specs. If you've ever listened to them, I definitely recommend checking out their album Germ Free Adolescence if you haven't. This sounds along those lines stylistically to me, which I think sets these guys apart right now, because that's not a style that's really prevalent right now, but I think it's a cool one. Still, I feel like while they pull this off pretty well in terms of sound and style, the songwriting isn't really something that's going to keep me coming back. It's more of a novelty to me.
Yeah, I didn't find the songwriting to be overwhelmingly positive enough that I would come back to this one very often. Enjoyable, but really the comeback quality just wasn't that high. Next up, we have the new release from the metal band Hey Colossus called Radiostatic High. This is a mix of what I would call sludge metal and kind of drone music, along with some psychedelic blues influence. Overall, this is a very rhythmic sound as opposed to a lot of other bands in this genre. And what I liked about the vocals were they're a bit more throaty and screamy than I typically like. They really served a very as like a rhythmic device and helped push the sound forward. It was a part of the songwriting. They did a smart job of incorporating the vocals as an instrumental device that helped the songwriting rather than just something that sat on top.
Yeah, this one was one that I wasn't sold on at first, but it's something that I want to come back to because I can just tell that these guys are doing a lot of cool things that I think will take multiple listens to truly understand and appreciate. So I would recommend it. It's a very good sound, and I think there's some great ideas here. And we're moving on to even some more kind of sludgy metal, rock, hardcore, whatever you want to call it, with Kyles's new one, Exhausting Fire. Kyles is a band we reviewed a couple albums from, Spiral Shadow, as well as Ultraviolet. We really liked Spiral Shadow, really disliked Ultraviolet. I mean, it was night and day difference. Yep. I think that Exhausting Fire carries on a very similar sound, just very fuzzy, sludgy rock, with some kind of yelped vocals. It's not quite screams, but it's not, it's not really being sung. Yeah. It's almost kind of an immature vocal style.
Desperate yelling.
Right, but it works for them. I don't say immature necessarily as a negative thing. I found this one in terms of songwriting quality to be somewhere between the last two releases that I mentioned. Better than Ultraviolet, not quite as convincing as Spiral Shadow, but definitely some good things to come back to here.
Yeah, one thing I would say about this record is that the more I got into it, the further on I listened into the album, the less I really dug the songwriting. And I think that just kind of shows that these guys struggle at times with keeping their ideas in their songs fresh. They don't know how to present their ideas in a way that they can really make an impression and then move on to another idea. They kind of repeat the same idea over and over again. And maybe they're too focused on the sound, but at that time I'd say that they need to focus more on production. So this is an interesting band. These guys clearly have a lot of talent, but their polish has never been perfect, and this album certainly would fit that bill. October had a number of good folk albums that came out, and certainly Blitz and Trapper would fit that bill with their newest record, All Across This Land. As I said, this is a folk band, yet I would say that these guys are much more than that. They dabble in so many other different types of genres and influences that I think that they embody something more than just the typical indie folk artists that you hear so often nowadays. Pretty good songwriting all around, but one thing I would say is that this album is certainly kind of presented in that smorgasbord style where you have all of these different types of genres and influences present on this album. So the album never really feels like it has one cohesive sound. Inherently, when you have a sound like that or an album like that that's presented in this fashion, there's track displacement. Some tracks you're just going to like better than others. And so naturally, the complete album listen takes a hit. And this certainly fit that bill.
Yeah, I like this one significantly less than you, Jake. I just found it to be pretty boring. I do like the style they're trying to go for, and I've liked some Blitz and Trapper's previous releases, but this one just really didn't do much of anything for me. And now, last but certainly not least, in fact, I really think that we saved dessert for the last course here, Jake.
I always save dessert for last.
Really? See, I'm one of those kids who likes his chocolate before anything else. But
yeah,
no,
I have to eat the food that I like the least, that I'm least excited about. Yeah. I have to eat that first.
Build
and then
up to
save the thing that I'm really looking forward to for last.
Well, the thing that we're really looking forward to here in this case is Deafheaven's new album, New Bermuda. This album is absolutely incredible, and I've had a lot of hope for it ever since Sunbather came out a couple of years back, which was honestly probably in my top 3 albums that we reviewed as Velocities of Music. I loved Sunbather, and so there were high expectations for New Bermuda, and I wasn't really sure if Deafheaven could ever meet those, but I think they totally did.
I think they exceeded expectations. New Bermuda is my favorite album of the year so far, and I cannot stop listening to this record. I would say as far as Deafheaven sound goes, this is progressive metal. This is what this is. At times, if you took the vocals out of this, it would be it would be post metal. That's what this would be, and a lot of just sprawling song structures. These are longer songs, and one thing that this group has just always done well, that they absolutely do fantastically at on New Bermuda, is dynamic contrast.
Oh yeah,
they really know how to build their sound throughout a song so that it really hits at a climactic point and makes a statement. And then also, these songs carry a lot of emotional weight too. The third track on this album starts with a lot of piano and then slowly just builds up into these just massive cataclysmic guitar riffs that just blow me away. I mean, I can listen to this album over and over and over again. And in fact, one trait that I realized with New Bermuda that so few albums anymore have this trait is that when I listen to this album and I finish it, I can't think of anything else that I want to listen to besides that album again. So I just put on New Bermuda again. There are so few albums that I feel this way about that I know New Bermuda is just one of those special records that I'm going to love forever.
Right, and it's the perfect progression from Sunbather, which I will say I still like Sunbather a little bit more, but I think that if these guys continue to put albums out of this quality, I already think that with just these two, and of course they had an album before that, Roads to Judah, which is pretty good but very different. But I think that with Sunbather and New Bermuda, they're setting themselves up to be one of the best metal bands of our time.
Yeah.
Without question. I mean, just these two albums back to back, but what they've done is they've kept a lot of the core identity of themselves as a band, but they brushed some of the cobwebs out of the production. It's not quite as, what some people have called shoegazy or reverbed out. It's a little crisper, a little clearer. They're incorporating a lot more kind of typical metal tropes with those galloping triplets in the guitar, with the wah solo that you get in track 3, some things like that Sunbather didn't quite have. They've also shortened it a little bit. They cut out some of those interludes. Sunbather had those kind of alternating tracks of being like a song and then kind of an interlude and so on. They've more just integrated those into the 5 core tracks of New Bermuda. But man, it is a listening experience that I completely agree with you, Jake. When it's done, I just want to listen to it again. And I am absolutely amazed by it.
So that wraps up our October 2015 review or summary of all the albums that came out that Tom and I listened to and our recommendations for you. What albums that came out in October did you guys fall in love with that you absolutely can't stop listening to? Tell us which album and why at www.velocitiesandmusic.com, youtube.com/velocitiesandmusic, or send us an email right on our Facebook wall. Send us a tweet on Twitter because we reluctantly get on Twitter every now and then. But overall, just what a quality month of music.
Yeah,
a ton of great albums were released across a number of genres that Tom and I are very familiar with. So we're really curious to hear your thoughts and reflections on the album, your favorite albums from the month. So like I said, shoot us a comment and we'll be back in November for there's probably going to be less albums that come out in November and December.
It's going to dwindle, I bet.
It will. So, this is a long podcast. I'm sure November and December will be a bit shorter, but man, totally worth it because of all the great music that came out.
Yep.
I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are Velocities in Music, moving music discussion forward.